All right, this is the fourth lecture video for week 3 for IT 45 and IT 386. I'm going to focus on just Photoshop and all the areas and tools of Photoshop that you should be aware of. I know that last week I went quickly through the creation of the concept artwork, so I'm just going to hit every area of Photoshop that you should be really aware of to be prepared for the texturing workflows and to just, start to develop your skills in Photoshop and create the best concept artwork you can. So anyway, this is Photoshop CS4. It probably looks just a little different than CS6, but its majority is the same functionality. You might have little update areas on brushes and bringing in files. But on the whole, this is going to be a really good basis for just understanding Photoshop and all the areas and that I think are slowing people up a little bit. So anyway, up here, standard menus for a program up top. Here we have, I'll get through these in a bit. Here we have the options menu. This is context sensitive based on the tools that you select on the left panel here. So here's your toolbox, and each tool that you select on, you see that the options up here changes. So in using a tool, and if it's not working right, chances are you can change it somehow up here to make it work the way you need to. The other area to be aware of is this right-hand part where there's all these panels. And if you pull these things apart and delete them, you can redock them and stuff. But if you just make a mess of the whole thing and don't know how to get them back, just go up here to Essentials, and it'll just reset all these panels here on the right-hand side to the basics. You can try other stuff. Would modify, sure. So this basic one that I clicked is gonna just change the whole setup a bit more, and you can go down these and they'll all have different setups here on the right hand side, but all they're doing is exposing different areas of the program that are in this kind of hotbar area that are quick to access, but they're really all here under Windows. So if I pull out color and delete it, I could come up here to Windows, Color, and there's that panel. I could even pop it back into place. There we go. All right, so all of these panels, basically all the areas of the program that you can work with are here under Windows. All right, so File, under File is pretty standard. When you click New, this is some area that you kind of have to be aware of. You should have watched the canned mushroom videos by now. The big thing to be aware of is resolution. We have some presets here. Usually it's US paper, which is 8.5 by 11 inches at 300 pixels per inch, which is for print. And then you see here I have some like default setup. Like this is like a standard setup for creating textures or working computer graphics is 1024 by 1024 at 72 pixels per inch. So you can create your own custom ones and then save it out, and they'll load up here. So it doesn't really matter what you're working with at this point. You can always change it later because chances are references you drag in, they might be at 300 or 72 pixels per inch. But just be aware, this is basically your canvas that you're going to be working on, the largest area that you can work within and save out. But 200 to 300 resolutions for print, so usually we're going to want to be in 72. Color mode, you can just always leave it RGB. If you're more interested, the canned mushrooms videos goes into the rest of these. But for computers, we're interested in 72 pixels per inch at RGB and usually at 8-bit. I mean, he does go in and show you how to get more color depth, but just to standard out, RGB 8-bit, don't really mess around with color. Square pixels, and that's all you really have to be aware of in the file. So the two big things to be aware of is when you first save, you have to save as, and you're going to be saving a Photoshop file. But when you're saving other images for, say, putting up on the forum, you know, you have JPEG, you have to save as, then you have access to saving out different image formats like JPEG and PNGs are going to be the big ones. All right, actually, I just wanted to make note, when you're later on down the road, you may be concerned with alpha channels, which is for transparency, say like glass and stuff, you want it to be semi-transparent. Just be aware that you may get involved with alpha channels, and if it is, this will be highlighted if you have an alpha channel turned on. So that's all you want to be aware of in the save menu. Now that I created a file, you see the name of it's here, the zoom, and the color, RGB 8-bit. So I could do control minus and plus to zoom in and out, and you can see the zoom value changes. Just so usually you zoom all the way in when you're working on details, cleaning stuff up, and you zoom out to see how it looks. Notice that there's rulers on the side here. You can turn them on and off under view, rulers. Usually I leave them on. They're going to be really helpful for making sure stuff is lined up. If you click and drag from them, you click out these guidelines. And this is, I think I was doing it in the other video where I was showing that my concept artwork wasn't lined up, and I was using these guidelines to make sure everything was straight. So you can drag them in, and then when you hover over them, you get this kind of double arrow, and that's when you can drag them off your canvas, drag them all the way up to the ruler to make them disappear. All right, so the white area is your canvas. The gray area is your background. You can change these colors under preferences here. I think it's general. You'll note that actually it brings up all the options that we're showing under preferences. So you actually don't, if that wasn't the right one to click on, you can click through here instead of going to cancel and going back all the way through. But it's showing like your guideline colors and everything. You can change a lot of stuff. How your cursors look, performance, file handling. Okay, and here's your background. So standard screen mode. So you can change it to black, gray, or custom color. That was under edit and preferences. That's pretty much all I use in here, because you can do undos. So let me just introduce the brush tool real quick. I'll get into them a bit more, but what I want to do is I'm just going to do a few brush strokes. And when I do edit undo, and you see that my undo is gone, now I'm back to redo. Undo really only goes back one step in Photoshop. It's a little strange. Usually used to being like constantly you could press Control Z and go back, you know, several steps. Like in Maya, you can go back to 20. You can even set it to go back to 50 or more. But in here, undo really isn't the main tool. It's actually the history panel. So if you go Window, History, and if I just open this up, you see that I kind of have this list built out. And if you look at it, it kind of makes sense of what I was messing around with. New document, new guideline, new guideline, new guideline, drag guideline, delete guideline, drag guideline, delete, delete, delete. That's actually in order of what I was just doing before. And this is saying brush tool, brush tool, brush tool, brush tool, brush tool. 6 brush tools, and if you see I have 6 strokes here. So you see if I click up this history list, you see as the tools below it are grayed out, and you see those strokes in order are being deleted. Or you could click back and bring them back in, and then I can even go back and bring in guidelines back. Everything I did, you know, maybe there's a certain amount of steps. I think it's 20 or 30 is probably in preferences. But anyway, I can go back to a point that says this is basically your undos, and then you could go again. Then you notice all those grayed out brush tools disappeared because I created a new line of history. So get really comfortable with the history tool instead of edit undo. That's a big strangeness about this program. So edit, undo. And so there's the transforms I'll get into later. Everything else, that's about it. The rest of this stuff is more advanced stuff. Image. This image panel is used a lot. And here we have the mode that we're currently on, which is RGB 8 bits. You can see that here, RGB 8. Also, when you see this little asterisk star here, that means that this document has unsaved changes in it. So you should know to save if it's been really important. Adjustment layer. We'll get to this a lot. This is used a lot to change colors and many different attributes of a bitmap image. Don't really use these. Image size, canvas size. This is for changing after you've already created a document. If you want to change the width, height. This is in pixels. This is in inches with the resolution. So there's a very strong connection between the width in pixels, the width in inches, and your resolution pixels per inch. That determines one and the other. And if you notice, this is locked, meaning the proportions are locked. So if I change this width, you see that my height changed and the width and height in inches down here changed because they're all linked. You can only have a certain amount of pixels per inch, which is your resolution. That determines, so if you're changing the pixels, it's going to change the inches. And if you change the inches, it'll change the pixels. So it's also changing my height to keep the proportions locked. But I can click off this. See, constrained proportions down here is turned on. I turn that off. It'll turn off the constrained proportions. So if I change the width, you see it changes the width in inches down here, but the height stays the same because now we're not constraining the proportions with the height. So I turn it back on and it pops back to its original numbers, and I can change this value, and you see how it changes the height value too. So we have image size and canvas size. So canvas size is the actual canvas, the full area we're working with. I'm going to shrink the history down, so I'm going to click on these arrows here to get rid of it. You notice it docks up into this little panel here that you can click to open it again, or you can go up to Window and History to open it again. These are just kind of these quick tabs. Anyway, back to images. So we have image and canvas size. So they're a little different. Canvas is like, you have to imagine like a traditional painter. He has a big canvas and he starts to fill it up with paint. So your image is like what you're painting, and your canvas is like your full empty area that you started with. So if I change my image size, say if I make it 10 times as big, I probably won't even see it anymore. Let me see. All right, I really have to zoom out. He's like 10 times as big. Let me do an edit, undo, and come back in. So he like changed the entire image I'm working on. And if I change the canvas, I bring it over here, and if I do, yeah, it looks a little different. It's only we only have this width and height. You can do as pixels or inches. If I change it to pixels and I do the same thing, basically 10 times, what happened is it enlarged the canvas that I'm allowed to paint on, but left my image, which was, it just happened to be the same size, but they can be different. Later on, you'll see how it gets different. But you see, as I paint, you paint off the canvas, I can't paint anymore. It ends at the canvas. So I can paint all over this canvas. And then if I canvas size it and shrink it back, see, I'm going to shrink the canvas size down. It says this new canvas size is smaller than the current canvas. Some clipping will occur, meaning I'm shrinking my canvas out, and it's just going to get rid of all the image that was sitting on the canvas. Now we're back to original canvas size, and only, but you see the addition of this paint here was added when the canvas was larger. But when I shrunk the canvas, it got rid of the image that happened to be sitting on the canvas in those areas where it got rid of the canvas. So think of the canvas as a traditional artist canvas, in that the image is the paint that you're painting on, or which happens to be these layers here, or any images that you bring on to the canvas. So there is that difference between the image and the canvas to be aware of. Image rotation, we use a lot to flip stuff. Actually, I showed you in the concept artwork, like mine came in upside down, and I flipped it. This will be a useful tool to be aware of. You're going to be like rotating and scaling stuff a lot to make it fit within this UV layout of your model. I don't really mess with the rest of that stuff. Layer we'll be getting into a lot. Select we get into a lot, especially with the inverse. And you have to get comfortable with these selection tools in Photoshop, because this is really the selection tools and the layers is like the heart of Photoshop, what you're able to manipulate. You're always got to be selecting something. So you have all, selecting everything, and you can deselect it. When you select something, you'll get these what's called the marching ants, just this dotted black line that kind of slowly moves. That's just be careful when you're using certain tools and not working right. It's usually because of what you have selected and what layer you have selected. Right now, I just have one layer, this background layer. It's highlighted blue. That's because I have it selected, and now I have everything within that layer selected with the marching ants going around it. And so if I do something to this layer, like I can use one of these filters that I'll get into. Nope, that wasn't a good filter. Let me just do a blur. If I do an extreme blur on this, you see it blurred everything. But if I just select these guys, let me select the rectangle tool. I'll get into selection in a minute. If I just select these and do filter, let's do, I guess, another just extreme blur on it. You see that it blurred out just within this selection. It didn't blur out the rest of this image that happens to sit on this layer. So you're going to build up many layers. Each one you're able to manipulate individually, and not only that, but whatever you select on that layer, you're manipulating. So get really comfortable with selection tools and layer tools. All right, so I'll get into select a little bit more, but what's really important, all deselect and inverting your selection. I'm also modifying. I'll get into that a bit too. Filters, there's many things you can use them for. They do many different distortion, blur effects, as you saw, turning stuff into making it look like it's charcoal, or it just makes another effect from the pixels that are on their scene. So usually most of these things you'll click will bring up this other window. And in it, if you click on stuff, you'll see a preview. And then over here is stuff you can select, or filters that you select that will actually change your your preview. And again, this is the layer that I'm working on, which is over here. And then here's some details of not details, options of how to change this filter. And as you do it, you'll see that, how it affects what look you're trying to achieve. So you see really quickly you can make some pretty crazy effects just from understanding layers, select what you're selecting, and using filters on them. View, not really much here. Zoom in, zoom out, but I use the control plus and minus to zoom in and out. Notice the inches on the rulers change values. This is negative, this is positive. I'm just going from 0 to 8.5 because remember I made a US paper document which is 8.5 by 11, 0 to 11. The only thing to really be concerned of is pixel aspect ratio. Right now it's square, meaning each pixel is a square, which is correct for computers because a computer monitor is composed of little squares, little pixels that are squares. But as you see on different TVs or different outlets, you might not get a square, which is 1 to 1. You know, the width and the height are the same ratio. These ratios are a little different. And as I click them, you see how it changes. Let me do an extreme one, and you see how it changes my artwork, my canvas, my image. So just be aware that if like you bring in an image and it looks weird or something, try clicking this pixel aspect correction. Or actually, as the error was saying, this is for preview only. It's just to figure out what's wrong with it. If something looks weird, try doing this pixel aspect correction. And then if it looks right, you know that there's the pixels are not square, and you got to go in and make them square. Happens. It doesn't happen too often, but it does happen when you grab images online and they weren't formatted correctly, and you'll get some weird issues. Sometimes when you save out your own images, sometimes if that happens, just be aware of it. It happens to be this pixel aspect ratio. Window we already kind of hit on. I'm not going to hit on these more advanced kind of setups. So basically you can create all your different setups and keyboard shortcuts or what have you. All you got to really be aware of is if you're looking for something and it's missing, search in here, especially history. Or if this panel over here is all goofed up and you delete stuff, you don't know what's going on, you just go up to Essentials up here to open, use the preset layout. I think I'll go over here to Tools. So we have the Selection tool. Pretty explanations for moving. It's the the movement tool, not the selection tool. These are lining up with other parts. You can play with them. Maya has a similar setup, but I'm just going to create another layer. Let me get into. It'll make more sense playing with these tools if I can deal with layers for a second. So I'm going to skip everything here. I'll get to these a bit. I just want to talk about layers. Right now we just have a background layer and it's selected. You could tell that because it's blue. You see that this eye here, I can turn it on and off. Oh, can't even see the background. All right, so background is locked by default. Whenever you create a Photoshop file, you're always going to have this initial background layer, and it'll be locked. It's just so that there's some type of layer to start with, and that you can't. It's locked so you can't delete it. Because if you don't have any layers at all, then you can't be working with anything. So either you can create a new layer by going down here, or you can right-click on this and say Layer from Background, and just say OK. And what happens is it gets rid of that lock. It's not a background layer anymore. It's just a normal layer. So now with a normal layer, I can turn it on and off. You see how as I turn it off, I get these little checkerboard squares, which means nothing. You see that when you start working with transparencies, you might start to see these checkers. That's not an actual real pattern that will be in your image. This is just its way of saying there will be absolutely no pixel information in this area. All right, so I have layer one. You can make another layer with this button down here. Create a layer. Again, you can turn him on and off, but there's nothing there. In fact, you can see this little box here is like the thumbnail. This kind of is a quick representation of what's within this layer. And you see that it has these little checkerboard boxes, which means it's a transparent layer. There's nothing in it. So I'll just take the brush tool real quick and just paint something on it. Now, if I turn this layer off, you can see that the representation in here to what's actually on the layer is the same, meaning it's all transparent, and then we have this black marker on it. So I could try using this fill bucket and filling, and it filled everything that was on this layer that was not like painted on. So it filled up everything except that brush stroke I created. And if I zoom up on it, you see my brush stroke still, you can see checker patterns behind it because I was using a kind of semi-transparent brush. So like its brush stroke is not doing 100% paint on this layer. So that's what this is. This information right now is telling me is that all this is like 100% painted black. This brush stroke is a black brush stroke, but it has a transparency. It's not fully opaque brush, and you can see the pixels underneath it. But if I turn the layer on underneath it, you see those pixels go away. And it's because it's reading the layer underneath it. So this layer up here has some see-through transparency, and you're looking down into the layer underneath that. You might be able to see more if I can use this eraser tool, and I'll start erasing, and I'm kind of exposing the layer underneath it. So and maybe I should talk about these options up here now. So right now the eraser tool is selected. The opacity is at 31%, meaning this brush tool is only erasing a third of the information, of the paint information that's on this layer, layer 1. So it started with a fully opaque black. So as I'm painting, you see I'm exposing the layer underneath it by something like 30% each time. So you see it's starting to become clear after I paint over and over again. But if I change this opacity back up to 100 and I paint once, you see it's fully exposing what's underneath. The other thing I want to talk about is a brush size. You could click here and change the master diameter. So even though it's an eraser, it's actually a brush also. It's just all it's doing is removing paint instead of adding paint. But it still uses these same brush characteristics. I'll get into that in a second. But anyway, use the master diameter, meaning how big it is in pixels. So you see how big, and then you can see an image of it here. And then hardness means the fall off from the center of the brush. So if I click here and I'll zoom in, you see it's got like a soft fall off on the edging. Where if I raise this hardness up, and I click again, you see it's got a hard fall off, like the entire brush stroke erased what was on this layer, and now it has crisp edges because I increased the hardness up and lowered the hardness, and you get that soft again. So just be aware of a few things. I'm going to zoom back out. Notice that I'm on this layer. If I click on layer underneath it and start erasing, you don't see anything. But you do notice that like on layer above it where there's transparencies, as I erase, all of a sudden it is actually influencing it. You're starting to see the transparency. And what's happening is if I click underneath, I'm actually painting out the layer underneath. So I click down to this layer over here. That's why it's blue. I don't see the layer above it because I turned it off with the eye tool. And you see I'm starting to erase that layer underneath. And you start to notice it only in the brush area. I'll do it here. Oh, actually, you have to be careful now. I selected layer 1. Let me go back, select layer 0, and I'm going to paint here. You see no change on my artwork, right? But if I hide the layer above it, you see I was erasing here. If I bring this layer back, and if I start erasing, I'm still on this bottom layer here. If I erase here, you see that you actually see something going on. And why is that? That's because this layer up here, this area wasn't fully opaque. I was using like a transparent brush. So it was looking through. So when you have these like layers of transparency, this layer isn't a fully opaque painted layer. So you can see the changes happening underneath it on this layer. So be really aware of what layer you're clicked on. And if you need only certain sections selected to do whatever modifications you're doing. While I'm talking about layers, let me just finish it up here. We have opacity. If I lower the opacity, you see this layer 1 is like slowly disappearing. So it's like adding a transparency onto the entire layer, or lowering the opacity of the entire layer, and you can see the layer underneath it coming through. All right, that'll be handy for doing scratches and bloods, and when you're layering a lot of effects, you can lower the opacity and stuff to see through underneath it. Fill is very similar, but it's only opacity and fill has to do with if you have layer effects going on, layer styles. I'll get into that in a second. Just when you want to affect the whole layer, just use opacity. Fill is when you get involved with layer styles. I'll show that later. So lock, you can lock the position of this layer. You can lock the pixels so you can't paint on them. You can lock only transparent pixels. So you can lock the painting on this layer. And you see I have this this like I can't do anything icon on my mouse. That means I can't paint. So if you're really happy with a layer, you lock the painting so that you can't influence it anymore. But if I click the move tool, I can move the whole layer. So you see it gets moved here, it gets moved here, it gets moved in its little icon down here and up here. And I did it twice, so I can't undo. So I have to use the history tab to move them back. So you can just move the whole layer like that. But if I lock down the move tool, now I try and move it, says could not complete your request because the layer is locked, right? And then we have lock transparent pixels. So this is a color tool down here. The foreground, background color. Right now it's just useful for swapping. Like you can click here and like if you have two main colors you're using, it's really easy to swap them back and forth. Like here I can paint with white now, or now I can paint with black. So here's white. Real quick I can swap back and there's black. That's the main use of this. It's used a lot in some render effects when you're using some filters, specifically clouds, for getting this noise distortion. You're going to use both colors. But don't worry about that right now. Just know foreground, background, your brush is going to take the foreground color. You can click this little icon to set back to your default. So say if I select a color here and I select another color on my background, I can click this color and pop it back to normal. So if I click the foreground, you see it says foreground color, and click the background here, got my background color. And you can swap them. Red, there's green, or return back to default. So with transparent locked, what that should mean is that transparent colors you can't paint on. So see, I can like paint, let me swap it out to like, it'd be a little weird to see like this is semi-transparent, so as you see I'm painting on it, it's not getting like blacker. But if I paint over here, you see that it's working because there's no transparency, it's fully opaque. So it's a little weird. All you got to really be aware of is like total lockdown. You don't want to move it, or you don't want to paint on it. And this is blending. I'll get into that in a bit. So and down here, layer styles, right? Layer masks. I'll get into those later. Yeah. The only thing is you're going to make a lot of layers. So here are groups. Groups are handy for starting to organize your material. So like I can click my layers, shift click them, and I can actually move them, drag them into group one. So you're really going to start renaming stuff, like maybe there's my base group, base textures, and then I'll make another group on top that has several layers, and that'll be my scratches, another one for blood, this and that. So grouping is really easy to group your layers into relevant ways, and you can turn entire layers on and off at once, so it's really helpful. All right, let me move back to the tools here. So this is just the move tool. Pretty self-explanatory. You can just move something. That's a whole layer. But if I take the selection tool and I select something and then I move it, I'm actually just moving that selection. So that comes in handy too sometimes. Selection tool, when you see these little black arrows in the corner, that means the tool there's many tools underneath it. So hold down the left click and you have a couple different ones. Here's rectangle. You can make a rectangle. I can make a circle. Or these single row. You just click it and all of a sudden you have a single row. So I don't really use it that much. I'll really use the rectangle and the elliptical. So you can make a rectangle, or you can hold down the shift key and you can make a square of any size. All right. So as you're dragging something out, you can hold down the space key and you can move your whole selection while you're still holding down the left mouse button. Release the space key, and you can continue moving your size, your selection. So if you're trying to like line up, say with this rectangle here, I wasn't quite off, I'll hold down the space key, I'll get in really close, release the space key, but I'm still holding the left mouse button, continue dragging out my selection, and I have it. And then do whatever I'm going to do to it. It gets a little tricky when like you want to do like a perfect square. I'll hold down the shift key and I'll be able to make a perfect square. And then I'll hold down the space key while I'm holding down the shift key and left mouse button, and I'm able to move my perfect square. And then if I'm done moving my perfect square, I'll release the space key, but I'll still be holding the shift key and the left mouse button. Now, if I like my perfect square, I actually have to keep holding the shift key and then release the left mouse button. And now I'm able to release the shift key, and now I have my perfect square. Now, I'll get into these in a second. Same thing holds with the elliptical tool. You can drag out an elliptical of any size, hold the space key to move it, release the space key to stop and to enter into moving the selection shape again, and then hold the shift key and I get a perfect sphere. And while holding the shift key, hold the space key and I can move that perfect sphere. Have to release the space key and still hold the shift key. Release the left mouse button when I'm happy with my selection to keep that perfect sphere. All right, now we get into creating more complicated selections. If I drag out a selection and then hold the shift or the alt key, the shift I'll get a plus, alt I'll get a minus. Hold the shift key and I drag out another selection and I'm adding to it. Hold the alt key and drag out a selection and I'm subtracting from it. So this is how you get complicated selection shapes. It gets a little strange when you want to hold the shift key to add to it and then you want to do a perfect sphere. I'm sorry, we're not in 3D yet. Circle. But I'm holding down the shift key to add to it and then the space key to move it around. And I release the space key. I still can only have the add key when I'm holding the shift. So I'll release that. If you want to use the shift key to do a perfect elliptical or perfect rectangle, you can go up here. Here's where you have these add, intersect, add, subtract, and intersect. And these will be used in the 3D software too, so it's good to see these. Now if I hold down the shift key, no, I still hold down the shift key and it still is a regular rectangle. So that's a little, you kind of have to make your own perfect square if you're adding. But I think if you're subtracting, I hold down the alt key, I start dragging down and I hold the shift key, yeah, now it's perfect. So that's a little bit of a funkiness that they need to fix. The only other thing I saw was with the if you're dragging out and you hold the Alt key. So when you drag out, you're dragging out a square, rectangle from the left-hand corner, right? You're starting from the left-hand corner. But if you actually wanted to start from the center of the square, you actually hold down the Alt key. All of a sudden, you're not dragging from the left-hand top corner. You're dragging from the center of the square. So it's just a different way to create these objects. So now we have feathering. Feathering is pretty cool. It's like soft selection. So it was at 0 pixels, meaning no feather. So I'll put in 12 pixels, just saying do a soft feathering. So if I drag out the square, you see that it wasn't sharp edged anymore. And if I move it over here, let's say, you see I like pulled out a soft selection instead of a hard selection. So you see like it was like a soft fall off here, and then the object that kind of moved over to this transparency here has a soft fall off. So now we're dealing with feathering. It's your outer edge of your selection. So if I drag it over here, and if I do a smaller, let me just do like a 5 pixel one, make it a little easier to see. And if I click the move tool and move them out to say here, and I did like a solid area. This also contains some transparency, so it got a little weird. But let me pull it out, and you see that the section I pulled out is feathered, meaning there's a soft gradient fall off on the edges, and the area I pulled out you see is like that too. So that's feathering. That's used a lot. And then let me move on to polygon. So this lasso tool, you basically is like free form drawing. Hold down left key and you're able to draw out shape. Polygon's lasso tool is you click one area, you click another, and you're able to draw out in these hard edge lines. So this is used a lot. You saw that in my concept artwork. I actually was able to do selections with the lasso tool. It's a polygon lasso tool, and it's very easy to select straight away. I think if you hold the shift key, you get like 45-degree increments of hard snaps around your next point of selection. All right, and you press the enter, and it finishes. If you're ever stuck in a tool, you can press the escape key, the enter to complete it, escape to end it. If you did a selection, you don't like it, just do deselect. Always get out of a selection. Be aware of what you have selected, what layer you have selected, and what you have selected within the layer whenever you use a tool. That will heavily influence it. So when you select something, the only thing I wanted to say with the selection is there's the modify here, where you can expand it, contract it, feather it. So I can contract it up. Say if I contract it 20 pixels, watch this triangle, and he shrunk 20 pixels. You can do the same with expand, and you can feather it, meaning feather radius. Same thing, add a feather to it, meaning a soft fall off. And then the other one is you can do a modify, refine edge is like another stronger tool that kind of combines all this stuff, feathering, radius, and contracting, expanding, blah, blah, blah. A little more advanced. That's really all you have to understand about selecting. We have the magic wand, which selects based on color. So right now I have this layer selected, and it's selecting everything that's of the same color, hence black, but the whole layer is black, so that really doesn't mean much. So let me like pick a red, and I'll paint some red here, paint some here, and I'm going to change the hue a little bit, maybe to this pink, and I'll paint here, maybe down here, and it's darker. Okay. So let me use the tool, and as you see, it just selected this red area, and it didn't even select the entire thing, just like the meat of it. So that has to do with this tolerance. I'm clicking on other selection tools, and I click off the canvas to do a quick deselect, but what you should probably just be doing is go select, deselect, or Control D was the shortcut if you want to deselect something. If you increase this tolerance and click again, now you see it's actually wider. And what's happening is it's selecting at the edges of it. Remember, the brush had like a soft fall off, so it's actually getting a little black around the edges, hence changing the color a bit. So what this magic wand is doing is it's saying the tolerance, like how many tolerant do you want me to be select colors that are similar to this main color you're clicking. So I'm clicking this shade of red, and it's trying to find all that shade, all the pixels around it that have that shade of red with this level of tolerance. So if I make the tolerance really low, like 10, do Control D to deselect, and I select again, you see you get a smaller area. It's not selecting those outer edges, which have up some black in them. The other cool thing is if I turn off this contiguous, I guess that's how you say it. I click here, you notice that it also clicked this red up here. So it's that saying is I'm able to move that, you see? So it's selecting two areas which are separated. It's finding all the color that's in this layer within this tolerance and selecting it even if they're separated. So I do Control D. If I turn that contiguous back on, just this area. So that's important to note what you're trying to select if there's like boundaries around it. So it's good for selecting really soft areas, or if there's really it's easy to select colors instead of shapes. So you got your shape selections and your color selections. If I increase this tolerance a lot, maybe let's try like 400. You can only go to 255. Let me try that. Now I was hoping to like grab this pink next to it. Oh, it does. Okay, that's because I had contiguous on. So if I turn that off, contiguous means it selects all the colors that are within this really high tolerance. So it even selected this pink. It even selected this really muddy pink, and I must have had some a residue of red paint over here. So that's the whole magic wand. There's quick select. I don't use that. It's kind of funky. You can try it. Tries to be like smart, but it's better to do your own thinking. Cropping. I don't use the other tools. Crop is like if you just want a certain section, you want to delete everything else. You select it, press delete. Now it like cut out my canvas and my image to just this size, and that's cropping. I use that a lot when you bring in reference images for texturing and you only want a certain section, you'll crop it, or it's just easier than going through and manually changing the canvas and image size. Eyedropper is for selecting color. See it turned pink. Turns out I can try and get this green. It's for grabbing colors from different areas so that you can then use the brush tool, which I'll jump to now. The spot healing is a little bit, this healing tools are more advanced. I'm not going to get into them. Brush. Okay, so up here under our settings, again, I got into this a little bit with the eraser. Master diameter, just how big your brush is. Hardness, how the fall off of your brush. Hardness down, makes for a softer brush on the edges. I actually have like a custom brush selected, so let me just select a standard, like a dot brush. I'll raise the diameter so as I paint. Oh, it's not, that wasn't that. All right, I must have the spacing. Let me get into the brush setup in a bit. Mode, I don't really use this a lot. The actual modes, these blending modes, I use a lot with the layers, so I'm not going to hit that with the brush. Opacity, how opaque, how much transparency, 100%, your brush stroke is fully opaque, a really low number. So usually I'll use a soft brush and you build the colors. That's like a real standard art flow. Flow is how much paint comes out. Let me see if I can, flow and opacity to me, like, do the same thing, but, so you see flow is like my paint's fully out. If I lower this and drop it, you see, each brush stroke, each circle that comes out is like almost like a brush stroke. You see that as I lowered the flow, each circle is really light, meaning only like a 19% flow of ink is coming out, or paint is coming out. So flow and opacity have a weird relationship. Flow is like how much ink is coming out. You see when I have a flow of 100, like each circle is fully brushed in. But if I like lower the hardness of the brush and I paint again, Oh, I meant opacity. You see that there's like this mixture between, let me raise hardness all the way up. If I paint it, now you see like I'm getting the same thing, like a solid circles, they're just transparent. So if I bring flow, opacity all the way up and bring flow down, now I'm getting like this effect. Like each circle or each paint drop or each brush stroke, as you want to view this, maybe a paint drop is better. You can actually like see each paint drop because the flow of paint drops is low. So a flow of 100 is so much paint drops coming out that they look all together. A low flow, you can actually see each circle. And then the opacity, so if I have a high flow, low opacity, it's going to be like a steady, the same thing, like a steady stroke. It's just each circle, like full circles, just each of them are low opacity. So if I have high opacity, low flow, you can actually see each circle because each one is being dropped. Each circle is being dropped with like low opacity. So it's a weird relationship. I don't really fully understand it. When I work, usually I have a low flow and low opacity because I like to usually like build up my paint strokes. It's just a weird, for those of you who really want to get into it, I'm sure Canned Mushroom Guy talks about it a lot more. I've never really understood it though. That's as best as I can explain it, I'll say that. Brushes. So along with brushes, let me create another layer. And I'm going to grab some type of color, maybe like a dark blue. I'm going to use the fill bucket and fill. So I just want a new canvas to paint on. So I have these layers underneath here. I can just, even if I lower the opacity, you can see the layers underneath. I'm just going to bring it up. I'll talk about the fill bucket in a bit. I'm still on the brushes. So let's go to Window, Brushes. All right, so this looks familiar. This is this over here. It's basically what brush you want. This is a bunch of basic brushes. You have the hard edge, soft edge, and then this is a brush I custom made based on working with Canned Mushroom videos, and you can find those videos too. But let me set my colors back to default so I can get some black ink here. And if you click on, so you have brush presets, like your initial brushes, you could pick brush tip shape, your diameter size. This is interesting here. You can actually flip the angle and the size of your brush stroke. And this, if you have a tablet, this will all be like automatic based on the tilt of your pen. The hardness, your edge hardness, you saw that already. Now spacing, this is interesting. This is what you kind of saw with the flow, is a brush stroke is just composed of a series of dots or circles that get laid down. It's just what's their spacing. With really high spacing, as I paint, you see it's dropping them out with great distance between them. And they look more like a pattern or something than a brush stroke. And actually it's used a lot to create patterns like that. Or if I make start to lower the spacing more and even more, you see it turns into more of a solid line. But that solid line is really only composed of these circles. It's just that the spacing is really close. All these dynamics you can play around with. They're really cool, but only when you have like a stylus. When you use a pen pressure, pen tilt, is it really cool. But you can see with them, you see how my brush stroke is different now. But it's like the same throughout the whole thing. So you only, when you get a stylus and your pen pressure can affect this dynamically as you're painting, that's when you get a really, really cool effect. But unfortunately, I can only do so much. Since I'm using a mouse, but most of you are, so that's why I'm going to leave my lessons to that. So you can play around with this stuff. get some really cool effects going. Cannon Mushrooms has a whole section on messing around with your brush. I think it was like the 200 series of the CS Photoshop. If you want to learn more, I just wanted to get you to understand the basics. How you can click some brush presets, and then you can define them more with the brush tip shape. There's a bunch of brushes. Where's my brush library? You can get them online for free. Oh yeah, here they are. Okay, so I have like all these brushes, and they actually do a lot of cool stuff, like grunge. So if you want to do, let's see, hopefully there's some grunge in here. So it's like you can make like dirt effects. Like look how quickly I can make like tire tracks, tire marks, or grunge on a window. You know, that's what you get. These brushes will do a lot of your work for you. If you can find them. There's tons of libraries online. And you can make trees and hair. It's basically a brush is just like it's an image. It's a black and white image. Let's see, bloody brushes. Does this make blood streaks? Looks pretty stupid. Basically, they're just an image, a black and white image that you can actually paint yourself and create them. Blood. Let's see. Let's make another layer. Let's do another fill. Do a white. Well, if this is blood, let's pick red and see if we can make blood. Okay, pretty cool. Brush is pretty big. Oh, quick way to shrink and grow brushes is with the bracket. Left bracket, shrink, right bracket. The bracket keys are right under the plus and minus, right to the right of the P key. So it's a great way to adjust your brush like really on the fly. So this looks like a cool tool. You know, this is like getting some blood effects. And if you don't, you know, the cool thing is using a tablet with this, the pen will move all over the place. But if you don't like the angle, you know, I can adjust it this way as I'm painting to change the orientation of the brush. And again, the brush is just an image that's being laid down over and over again. So the most basic brush is a circle. So if I just do an ellipse, do a standard one, put them here, and say if I just do a fill of red, this is actually a brush, because you saw before how it just drops down circles, the real default brush. Like this could be a brush. Or if I draw out a circle, and then I go to select, modify, and just feather my selections, say 10, that's sure, and just fill that. And that's a brush stroke that has a soft fall off. So that's all brush strokes really are. And then you can create any type you want. And the Cannon Mushrooms has some cool videos on how to do that. So that's the brush. Clone I'll use a lot. You select one area. Let me hide this all. Hide you. This guy might be easiest to show it on. If you hold down, but yeah, you see that my tool's not working. That's because I'm on the wrong layer, because it's hidden, so you can't really clone, meaning duplicate, basically. So if I hold down the Alt key and click somewhere, and then click down here, I'm like painting that area. You see as I paint, the cursor moves with it. So it's like cloning that area. It's really useful. Erase tool, pretty explanatory. It erases, but in the same characteristics as a brush. Fill, okay, the fill tool. Let me create another layer. Fill is interesting. It grabs your foreground color. You can fill it, but you see that says foreground here. You can change it to a pattern. You can you can create your own patterns and grab them online too, so I can fill a pattern or just the foreground color. But now you see as I'm clicking around, I click fill, it's actually only filling parts of this. It's actually clicking, finding, it's in context to the layer I've clicked on. So this layer is not like a solid color. So you see I'm like clicking on, it's only filling certain areas. Let's see if I turn off contiguous. See, it's finding all the same color areas and filling it. So this could be useful for you sometimes. It's just like that magic wand has a tolerance, contiguous, blah, blah, blah. But if you just wanted to fill something, you can either do a rectangle, select the entire thing, or I go deselect to say select all, and then I'll use the fill can. Oh, he's still selecting stuff. He's only selecting it based on color. All right, see if there's a, so you got the paint bucket and the gradient. So paint bucket, looks like you need like some type of, let me go select, deselect, create a new layer. Looks like you need like a solid, if you wanted to do a full paint like that, you need some type of solid layer to fill. Or again, it'll fill within selection. Say I draw this rectangle here and I switch to black, go to fill, it'll fill just that area. All right, next, gradient tool. So we have some new setups up here. Basically, this is your color range of your gradient. Right now it's going from like a brown to white. So let me just drag, you click one area, click to another, and it fills it up with that gradient going from left to right. So where you first click is the left-hand side, and where you end up is the right-hand side. You can change the colors to change your gradient. See that? And you can move it to adjust like the fall off between the two colors. And you can even add more. I can click here and you can even add more colors to gradient too. So now when I do it now, I got a different gradient going on. And then this is going from like a linear, you can do different ones, a radial. See how you can like almost create some fire or particle or firework effects really quickly with the radial. And then you can play around with other ones. So it's a quick way to start building out some gradients. You can make some really quick, cool patterns like that. I'm filling up the entire screen, but again, if you do a selection and go back to the gradient, you're doing gradients within the selection. And it might be color sensitive too. For example, within this sphere, let me see. No, it does the whole thing. So let me check this layer. Yeah, it covers the whole layer. It's a little different than the paint bucket. Besides gradients, let me go back to the blood layer. And is this the smeared? I don't really use it too much, but we have the blur. So you can zoom in and you see I can blur it, like the edges are getting blurred out. It says if your edges are too sharp or something, you can use this to blur. Same thing, it's selecting, it's a brush type. You have to select how strong you want your blur to be and your strength. There's sharpen, the reverse of that. You can sharpen, it gets really pixelated. Smudge is, out of all these, I probably use smudge more at the most. So you can actually like mush stuff around. And again, it's brush based. This brush is different than the other ones. Every tool that's brush based, there's like the last tool used for that brush is remembered, not just like your own, that one brush for every tool. So this smudge tool, you see, it has a strange brush that's connected to it that's left over from last time I used it. So you just like smudging stuff together. Good stuff, might come in useful for whatever texturing effect you're trying to do. All right, now we have dodge and burn. You guys already kind of got involved with this a bit when you were doing your sphere shading. It's kind of hard to use. You see as I'm using it, it's like shrinking that red out. So what it's doing is dodge is lightening. So you see as I'm clicking these areas, it lightens, and burn's the opposite. Burn will darken. Then you have to play with these range. So Now we're introducing some talks of mid-tone, shadows, and highlights. Which is basically lights, darks, and mid-tones. That's going to bring me over to the color conversation. So I'll get into that too a second. Just know that if the tool's not working, try these different ranges: shadows, mid-tones, highlights. Also, if it's only, try turning off this protect tones if it's not working. It's a weird tool. Canned Mushrooms talks about it a bit and tries to get it discussion going on it and how to use it better. I use the brush tool, and I'll work with a light brush, and I can do a color picker, and I'll get into the color up here, how to use that instead of using dodge and burn, as it can be a little unpredictable. The pen tool, for those of you from Illustrator, you can draw out vector-based graphics. Let me do another layer and do that. So I'm not really going to get into that much, but it's cool if you're comfortable with it. I don't really use it in this program. If I use it, I'll use it in Illustrator. I use it a lot in Maya to draw stuff out. So once you draw it out, usually you can fill it. But since I don't use that tool that much, I'm not going to go into it. Text, if you need to add text, pretty simple. Type a text, size, blah, blah, blah. Notice that when you create that, you'll get a text layer. This is not a normal layer. Normal layers are called rasterized, meaning they're bitmaps. So you can mess around with this text layer by clicking on this text tool, and you can still change it. You can change the font type, the size, even the color. But when you want to do more effects on that font, if you want to like mess around with it, like blur it or smudge it or something, you can even curve the text too. Warp text, you can arc it, whatever, to try and fit, your texture. But when you want to do additional, you have to right click and say rasterize the type, and now you can see it actually changes it to a normal layer. And you can do stuff like I can smudge it now for whatever reason. Path selection, don't really use that. This is for making shapes. So you can make quick shapes. This is in line with the vector tool. Because you'll see down here, it's actually like you have a color attributed to it. You can change the color. That's like the fill. And then this is this type of vector mask. So it's like a mask. It's like this. It's only this white is saying it's only affecting this little area. So when you want to do more with this, you're gonna have to rasterize the thing again. And now it's a flat bitmap layer, and I can even do stuff like smudging and what have you. This stuff don't really. This is magnify, zoom in and out, and this is to move your around. But this is used more with if you're working on with tablets. So the color tool over here we talked about, but this brings me over to here. If you click on a color, when you're moving around, we have HSB, RGB, CMYK. RGB, red, green, blue, used for computer. CMYK, was it cyan, magenta, yellow, and something else, black. And so as you move it, you see all these numbers are changing. So the red, green, blue corresponding to this. This is for print. Computer, you don't have to worry about this. And here's the actual number of the color. So every number has this kind of this code to specify the exact color. Lab, I don't use this. I'm not going to get into it. HSB, I use a lot though. So hue, saturation, color. You see as I move up the color wheel here, well, it's not really a wheel, but, did I break it? I think I broke Photoshop. Here we go. All right, so as I move up here, you see the hue is changing, not the saturation brightness. Hue is in degrees, 360 degrees, because it's referencing a color wheel. It's just not, it's like the color wheel is laid out in a line. You should understand color wheel and color theory from the first week. So that's what hue is doing. Saturation and brightness, as I move it left and right, you see saturation is changing. Saturation is the amount of color. So at this hue, we're dealing with this type of greenish blue, mostly green. As I go left and right, change the saturation. It's like, how saturated is this color? 100% saturation means fully tinted, this color green. Go all the way to the left, saturation is 0, mean no color in there. So we're getting a gray, right? And halfway in between, we're getting like a grayish, muted out green with a saturation in the middle. Now up and down, I'm changing the brightness. Brightness is very similar to saturation. It's just the opposite to it. As you get no brightness of your color, you're in complete black. As you get full brightness, you're getting the full tones of your color are fully shown. So it's almost very similar to saturation. No saturation, we're getting in the grays. But if you have full brightness and no saturation, we're getting a white. But if we're getting full brightness, full saturation, we're getting the full color. And if we're getting no saturation, no brightness, we're getting blacks. But all saturation, no brightness, we're still getting black. So that's the little difference between brightness and saturation. But as I move up the brightness of the color, we're starting to get the color back. And this is a very important HSB. I use this all the time instead of RGB. You can specify the same numbers. See how these numbers, everything's changing? So there's a direct relationship between these hue, saturation, brightness, and the RGB. So I wanted to show you that because up here in the color, if I click here and click HSB instead of RGB, I get hue, saturation, brightness. So when you guys were doing your sphere shading, I was showing you the burn and dodge, but I was actually showing you the brush technique using hue, saturation, brightness. So let me change my brush. Right now I got a crazy like blood brush. But let me just go back to basic brushes. Just select one with a soft hardness. That diameter needs to go down. Okay. Let me click here to get out of the brushes. So I can use the color pick tool to pick this red. Use the brush tool, and now when I have the color showing here, I can lower the saturation and paint, and you see I'm kind of like painting in a highlight. Remember with the sphere, you're kind of painting the highlights and darks. So then I can maybe go pick the color again, color picker, and increase the lower the brightness, and now I'm painting in a shadow, and then lower the brightness some more. I'm increasing the shadow. Make something in between to start, getting our blending between the shadows. Right, and then you could even use that blur tool at the edges there, or what have you. But here, at least we're going from the main color, and I'm lowering the saturation to get the highlights, or reverse, increasing or lowering the brightness to start doing shadows. And all of the same hue. I'm keeping the hue the same, and this is very important to understand how this is affecting your color. And it looks for great highlights and shadows. If you start messing with the understanding how saturation and brightness is affecting your color, and if you leave the hue the same, see that the common mistake is say, shadows are black, and highlights are white. That's my sphere. Well, it's not really true at all. Actually, you're going through these different shades of this hue of red, these different saturation and brightnesses. So it is actually a really good technique to learn to use to create your highlights and shadows when you kind of paint in your highlights and shadows into your textures and make them look a lot more realistic. I think, okay, so I covered there. I covered layers. Layer blending is pretty interesting. You can just start playing around with it to see the effect that they have. Basically, a normal means this is just the basic color information. It's going to be laid on top of another one. Yeah, you can play with the opacities to see the layer underneath. But basically, a normal layer on top of a normal layer means you're just like adding another layer on top. Think of like pieces of transparent paper that you have painted on. You can layer them on top of each other, and you can kind of see through them, but you're just adding paint on top. When you're getting into these blending modes, you're actually, one layer on top is influencing the layer underneath. So what you're getting is, for example, in a darken, what it's saying is this layer, take its dark colors, will actually darken the colors of the layer underneath it. And the light colors won't do anything. They'll just be a basic color on top. And then these lighten, these in this section all do the same thing, darken, multiply. The dark colors darken the colors underneath. The light colors don't do anything, just add more color. This section here is the reverse. The light colors lighten the colors underneath, and the dark colors just add to. They don't interact with the layer underneath. And then we get these other layers. They have more of a complicated interaction. So usually what it does, you do multiply, because like you'll bring in your ambient inclusion, your shadows. I'll show you this later on. You'll use a multiply to darken. And if you're more interested in them, that 3D game textures book goes into there, because that's used a lot in texturing, and Can Mushroom does. But just be aware that if you want to like try and come up with some really funky, interesting stuff, like that's pretty cool. I'm getting these shades of green and blue. I'm just scrolling with the middle mouse wheel, and I'm able to scrub through these blending layers. I guess the only other thing I could talk about is layer styles. Oh no, and the masks. All right, so if you wanted to only use a part of this layer, you can take selections of it and delete it. But a good way. Let me go to history and back up. Another good way is you could right click on a layer and say create clipping mask, or you can say layer mask. Was that layer mask or clipping? I don't want to get into clipping just yet, actually. I don't have it shown here. You can right click and duplicate layer, delete layer. Clipping mask I'm not going to get into right now. I wanted to talk more about layer mask. Reveal all, so you'll get this lock number and this lock icon, and then you'll get this like other thumbnail. All right, so if you start painting here, you can only paint white and black. So right now I'm painting a mid-gray, so I'm making it transparency. It's easier if I do black. What I'm actually doing is hiding this layer. So I can increase my brush. It's basically like deleting the layer, and if you do a mid-gray, it's like a semi-transparent hiding. So white means the layer is revealed, black means it's hidden. And I do this because you can disable the layer mask or change the layer mask, but you're still keeping, it's a non-destructive workflow. So disable layer mask, the red X through it, it's not active. Then I can enable it, and so if things change, I can just change my layer mask. I didn't actually permanently delete parts of that layer that may screw me up down the road. Let me talk about the adjustment layers, because this will bring it to clipping mask. So I can do change hue, saturate. Basically, this is changing the hue, the HSB, the hue saturation color, hue saturation brightness of this. Or if you want, you could say colorize, and it'll actually change to that hue that you have selected. So what this is doing is it's basically it's sitting on top of all these. So the result you're getting at this layer, which is a combination of all layers underneath it, and then it does this type of adjustment on top. It's adjusting the hue, saturation, lightness. Now if you right click, you do create clipping mask, and I get this little arrow icon, it gets indented. It means it's only affecting this layer. So this change in hue, saturation, lightness is only affecting this layer. In fact, you see now that I have this clipping mask on this layer, meaning this adjustment layer is only affecting this. Clipping masks mean it's only affecting the layer beneath it. And since I have this paint effect going on, this means this part of the layer is black, hidden, which means this is not affecting this. That's why I'm getting my normal colors underneath here, and then I'm getting these funky results up here. So I can disable the layer mask. You see I'm getting funky results throughout, and I can enable it. And then this is like hiding this part of the layer from this effect. So now we're introducing two effects here, two things, a clipping mask, which means have this layer only affect the layer below it. And I only use it really for these adjustment layers. So if I remove the clipping mask, release the clipping mask, now this hue saturation is affecting everything underneath it, not just this layer. So there's times when you only want to affect the layer underneath you, or there's times when you want to affect everything. So these adjustment layers are really when I do it. So you have brightness, contrast. These are all like photography terms. Your brightness and your contrast, how the colors contrast each other. Vibrance, you can black and white. I can make the image black and white by having a black and white thing on top of it. And if I right click and say create clipping mask and move him down, this might create some weird effects. Create clipping mask. I'm only making this layer underneath me black and white, but he's a blending layer. And so all the layers underneath are actually still keep their color. So this is where you get some crazy, you just have to start messing around with this stuff. Just start adding adjustment layers, make them clipping masks, or release the clipping mask. You turn it off. Like I didn't like that black and white, so I could just hide it. Or if I did like it, I liked it when enabled a clipping mask and kind of just messed around with the colors underneath it. And just mess around with these. Like here's all the settings for the black and white. It's a little advanced stuff. I don't really feel like talking about it. But curves and levels are used a lot. So when we were talking about over here, you're talking about the dodge and burn tool, shadows, midtone, highlights. This is actually referring to the same stuff here. So levels. Is actually, if you start messing with them, it's actually messing with your color information, which is spread out over a spectrum. So you have you almost have the darks, the midtones, and the light tones. And this is actually like clamping down on the darks or expanding the light tones. So you see I can change your image pretty drastically by changing the information. And these bars up here is the histogram. It's just like showing how much color information is in this kind of value, this dark, mid-tone, and light tone. But if I can hide the layers and I'll do curves, curves is kind of taken over for layers. Curves is doing a similar thing, but you're actually like can put points on the curve and really funky it up a lot and kind of blow out your colors, or you can get some really interesting effects. In the background, you see the histogram. Again, it's doing the same thing. It's showing how much color data is in your dark range, mid-tone range, and light range. And then you can just mess around with your reds. I could blow up my red information. or my green information. You know, and get some really, like, I'm just doing it to create some random interesting effects, but really advanced people know what they're doing a lot more and use this tool to really make some fantastic results. But that's pretty much it. I'll use the hue and saturation a lot. I'll mess around with the curves if I'm really trying to make something really dramatic or fantasy like. The rest of these you can mess around with. So that I talked about clipping masks. I talked about layer masks. Vector masks is when you make vector tools, and then you got to rasterize the layer if you want to mess around with it more. And that was all up in here, layers, adjustment layers. This is what we were messing around with over here. Layer mask, vector mask, clipping mask. Oh, and layer styles. So this is interesting. If I hide all this stuff and I can get to, let's see. All right, so we have this blob here. Let me try get down a bit to this blood layer. This might be interesting. I can go layer, layer style, and then we have these layer styles. I can also go down here to this, and here's the same layer style. So if I drop, let's see, a drop shadow. No, you need cutouts. Let me see. It actually would work better. Let me turn this stuff on. It actually would work better with this layer, because if I look at it, it's all transparent. I just have this like blob that I was painting on. So it's a section. It's not. You can actually control and left click on a layer, and it'll select what's on that layer. So this layer, you can see, has got all these checker patterns, meaning they're all empty, except for this element. I created this shape and I painted on him a little bit, and I can do control click right on the layer to select everything on the layer, just to know it's a quick way to select stuff. But if this is where layer effects comes in handy. So drop shadow. Let me hide this blobs around it, and I'll zoom in a little bit on this guy so I can do a drop shadow. And you see it actually finds the edge of this shape, which happens to be the layer. This layer style is done on a whole layer, so you only really do it when you have shapes like this with nothing else on that layer. So drop shadow means he's making a shadow to make him look like a 3D element, like he's sitting on top of something. Inner shadow gives him an inner shadow, outer glow, inner glow. You can bevel, contour, try all these crazy effects on him. So what was really, like, this inner glow seems to have a really strong effect. And then here's like all the settings. Again, here comes the blend mode. So we're glowing, we're using these screens, these lightens. If you notice, I come up here to the shadow, he's using the multiply, right? The multiply darken to darken. So you can see these blend modes are actually in effect. Then you can like increase the opacity, the noise of it, the actual color. The actual color of this. You see it's affecting the color. I just went back to the new color. You can apply a gradient instead of a solid color. The technique of how you want it painted, the source, the choke, the size of it. See, they all have this certain effect. So you can make some really cool stuff with these layer styles, and you can mess around with them, and they affect the whole layer, and they're used best when that layer just has an object on it. And you can tell if you control left click, you can tell what's on that layer. And for me, this was just like a shape. So this is gonna be like, oh, this would be really cool to do some layer styles on it, because it's a pretty discrete shape. And I think, yeah, the convert to smart. Oh, the only other thing I wanted to talk about is when you bring in other images. So like when you're doing your concept artwork, you're dragging in other images. So you can either go File Open, or you can bring in your File Explorer and just grab other photos and drag them in. And since I'm CS4, what it does is it actually opens up another file. So here I can pull out from the docking of it, and I can move it around where I want, or I can move it back up here and dock it. But when I'm working in CS4, actually I'll move it out, so it's its own Photoshop file, and then I'll drag it into here. Either you drag it in, or you can do Edit, or if you're in here, you go Select All, and I'm in this file, and I go Edit, Copy, and then in here I can create another layer and do Edit, Paste. You know, it's doing the same thing as dragging it in here. And you notice, let me select on the right layer, and you notice that he's really big, so I actually have to zoom out. So that actually hits on something, Show Transform Controls. That actually reminded me of a section of knowledge to talk about. So if I turn off and on, here's Show Transform Controls, I can shrink up this image to make them fit correctly. But you notice it's like non-uniformly scaling them, so let me undo. I can hold down the Shift key and I can scale appropriately. And I want to move him, but you'll notice that it says, do you want to apply this transformation? When I move to another tool, you have to click Apply when you use a transform. So let me zoom in. And now another way to deal with, I could turn off the Show Transform Controls. He does away. This is the Edit Transform. So now we have we can rotate, we can flip, we can scale, which I just did, perspective, warp. So this is where you can, if there's perspective in a photo, you can try and mess with it, or you can just distort. It's a fun tool to just kind of mess with your photo to get more interesting results, or if you need it to bend this way because you're trying to give the illusion of it sitting on a plane at a different angle. Now, if I click on another tool, it's going to say something to me, or I press enter. Either way, I have to like confirm. I clicked on the move tool. Now, either I apply the transformation or don't apply it. It needs to know whether you want to keep it. So I can click don't apply, and it doesn't do it. So edit, transform. Here's some transform tools you can mess around with. So you can screw the image. I'll just press enter and save them. So that dealt with, I forgot all about the messing around with transform. So you have edit, you have all these transform tools. Or if you're clicked on the move tool, you can show transform and you'll get a transform tool. CS6, it's a little bit more advanced, but again, it's very similar. The only other thing, so that was how I bring images in. There's two ways. You drag and drop from another one. Now CS6, when you drag an image in, it'll actually pop it right in this file, and you'll get a weird looking thing. It'll look like this. It'll have this little icon like this, and this is a smart object. I don't really use them. I'm sure they're cool for whatever reason. Don't use them. So when I bring it into Photoshop, and I'll see that it's a smart object, and like CS6, if you can, you'll drag from like a file explorer, go file open, it'll bring it right into your Photoshop file to work with, but it'll look like this. It'll be a smart object. So you just right click and you say rasterize layer. It'll get rid of that smart object, just to make sure it's a basic rasterized layer, meaning it's just a bitmap layer to mess around with. That's pretty much everything. Adjustment layers, masks, already went over that. Layers, so here's channels, red, green, blue. And you got another one, and then you can start messing around with alphas. This is how you do transparencies. We'll get into this later on. Like the materials that get brought into Unity, you can create PNGs or targas or TIFFs that have a fourth channel, red, green, blue, and alpha information, which is a just a grayscale information. And you can usually use it for transparencies. Most of the objects are opaque, but sometimes they're semi-transparent like windows. Or you can also use it for your specularity information, your specular highlights, because an object can have many materials represented in a texture. So like a metal door with like a glass window, if most of this texture was metal, and then here's our window, maybe this has a different specularity to it, and you could paint, it would be like a white or even a transparency. So this is alpha mask, but alpha channel. And that's everything. It's a long video, but that covers everything in Photoshop that you need to understand to create concept artwork, create modeling references to get into Maya to model, and also to do your whole texturing workflow to get your asset into a video game. And this also covers all the main tools you would use to modify images for your demo reels, to post them up on forums, to show them off in any way. Thank you.